Good morning, everybody, and good evening to some of you. My name is Ermias Kabrab. I am the director of the World Food Center, Associate Dean of Global Engagement, and Professor of Animal Science at the University of California, Davis. Today, we are presenting the sixth in a series of independent dialogues as a precursor to the United Nations Food Systems Summit in September of this year. Today's dialogue targets track 4, which focuses on advancing equitable livelihoods. And today's dialogue is titled Innovations for Social Protection and Sustainable Graduation. Thank you for our facilitator, panelists, and other invited experts for being with us. And thanks also to those of you watching the recording of this dialogue. The format for today's event is as follows. The facilitator will give an overview of the topic, then introduce the panelists, and each panelist will give a brief presentation. After the presentations, there will be a moderated dialogue amongst all participants and panelists. We are looking for expert dialogue around 6 main areas. So this include providing sectoral context for the particular innovations under examination, why these innovations are important, what other themes or innovations in this action track are also important. We're looking to encourage discussion of potential gaps in science and evidence base that warrant continuing research, encourage discussion of the potential for these innovations to deliver food system solutions, whether they might even be considered game changers. Also looking to identify potential areas of divergence or debate among the experts and our participants, memorialize common perspectives and themes, and finally, foster expert consensus on next steps and new directions. Before we begin, there are a few housekeeping items to cover. Invited guests' microphones are muted for now. We'll unmute you after the presentations end. Please turn off your video for the first part of the event. And please hold your questions until the discussion period and use the raise hand feature in your toolbar to be addressed. And if you have issues, send a chat to the host and you will get targeted help. The video recording will be available in a few weeks on the World Food Center website. Now I'd like to introduce the facilitator of today's dialogue, Dr. Andrew Moody. Andrew Moody currently works at the African Development Bank as lead agri-SME development and financing, chartered with de-risking and enhancing the provision of finance for small and medium enterprises across the agri-food system. Andrew also supports the bank's Africa Disaster Risk Financing Program and previously worked at the International Livestock Research Institute, where he led the team developing and scaling index-based livestock insurance programs in East Africa. Andrew was the 2016 recipient of the Norman Borlaug Award for Field Research and Application, recognizing exceptional science-based achievement in international agriculture and food production by an individual under 40. Thank you for agreeing to facilitate the discussion today. And if Andrew is with us, I can pass it on to him. If not, Michael, would you like to say something? And then I'll introduce the rest of the panelists.
Those of you who, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Those of you who know Andrew know that I'm not Andrew, but very glad to fill in for him, and sorry that something's come up and he's apparently not going to be able to join us. I'm worried. I told him he needed to wear a tie and look very sharp for today. I think that must have scared him off, is the only thing I can imagine. In any event, let me just say a tiny little bit about what I think Andrew was going to share with you in terms of the logic of the panel. So the overall theme here is sustainable livelihoods. And within this, we brought together a group of us who are going to speak specifically around what are programs of social insurance, and specifically a lot of focus on what are called graduation programs that try to build up the ability of extremely poor households to have a stronger, more reliable livelihood. So the logic of the panel, we're going to start with Robert Osai, professor of economics at University of Ghana, who's been a participant in a number of very important studies in this area, and he'll give us his overview about graduation programs. Then we're going to switch to Samuel Willey, who's the director of the Kenya programs for the NGO called the BOMA Project, which is a very important instance of graduation programs in a particularly difficult and highly risk-prone environment, which I think raises some additional issues. So Sam will tell us about the work that they're doing and what they're learning and the model they have. Then I was to come in and I will talk about the complementarity between the kind of work that Robert and Sam will have talked about, and actually what you might call asset protection programs. That is, if the programs they discuss build up people's assets so that they have a stronger livelihood, especially in risk-prone areas, protecting those assets may also be important. So I'll draw some of the linkages there and reference a little bit of ongoing research in this area. And then finally, Federica, who works with the Africa Risk Capacity, is going to take us up a level and talk about new and very exciting efforts that are being carried out in order to use insurance-like principles to provide financing to governments in the continent of Africa when difficult events come along and increase the need of those governments to respond to the income shortfalls that many in their populations are experiencing. And then from there, we'll open up. We're privileged to be joined by Sarah Jansen, who's a professor in agricultural economics at the University of Illinois. So without further ado, Hermes, did you want to provide a more formal introduction?
Yes, sure. So I will introduce everybody, and then we'll go in the sequence that Michael just said. So first, I'd like to introduce Robert Osei. He's an associate professor in the Institute of Statistical, Social, and Economic Research, University of Ghana, and also the Vice Dean for the School of Graduate Studies at the University of Ghana. Robert's main areas of research include evaluative poverty and rural research, structural transformation and its implications for poverty and inequality and other economic development policy concerns. The second is Sam Willey, and Dr. Sam Willey is country director of the BOMA project and oversees the design, implementation, adaptation, and operations of BOMA's program in Kenya. Sam has earned more than 12 years of experience in building resilience among vulnerable populations through poverty graduation, social protection, and livelihood support programs. And prior to joining BOMA, Sam served as a livestock production advisor at the Land O'Lakes, Idaho, and goal specialist for food, agriculture, and disaster risk reduction at Practical Action East Africa. And Dr. Wiley holds a degree in veterinary medicine, master's training in climate change and adaptation, MA in project planning and management, and is currently pursuing MBA at the Southmore Business School. Michael Carter is a distinguished professor of agriculture and resource economics at the University of California, Davis, and honorary professor of economics at the University of Cape Town. He directs the Basis Markets Risk and Resilience Innovation Lab. His current research projects examine poverty dynamics and produce productive social safety nets, evaluation of interventions to boost small farm uptake of improved technologies, and feature a suite of projects that design, pilot, and evaluate index insurance contracts as mechanism to alleviate chronic poverty and deepen agriculture and rural markets. And Federica Carfagna, she has worked on the African risk capacity as vulnerable analyst since September 2009, and is now part of the research and development team as manager of the drought product development. A statistician by training, she is one of the main authors of the country risk profiling methodology to estimate the impact of droughts in terms of number of people affected and response costs, which the ARC insurance scheme is based upon. Italian national, Federica has a bachelor's and master's degree in statistics and economics from the University of Rome, La Sapienza. Okay, so now I call on Dr. Osei to give us his presentation.
Okay, so thank you very much. And let me begin by saying a big thank you to the organizers for inviting me for this expert to expert dialogue, just to share some thoughts and views on the graduation program generally. I think that generally with respect to dealing or working against poverty in the world and the large number of the poor, there have been different programs, and I believe that in the last 15 or so years, there have been quite increased a number of countries that have been engaged with social protection programs, largely cash transfers with the aim of actually helping the poor. The evidence, of course, is mixed with respect to the sustainability of the cash transfers in actually getting the poor out of the so-called poverty trap. And indeed, one is not too surprised because, again, I think there is this issue about the different dimensions of poverty and the fact that cash transfers alone cannot invariably tackle all the different dimensions together. Of course, we know that from a multidimensional perspective, poverty will mean a lack of resources and incomes, but also important dimensions such as the lack of voice in society and some of these poorer households being quite vulnerable to shocks. And so whilst cash transfers are sufficient, I believe that they are not, let's say, whilst they are necessary, they are not sufficient in terms of sustainably helping these poor people to move out of poverty. So generally, I think in my view, this piecemeal approach to dealing with poverty will not work, and it requires a more comprehensive approach. And it's not surprising that there is increasing emphasis on a livelihoods approach, which tries to tackle different dimensions of poverty and, again, better position these ultra poor households in terms of fighting against poverty or moving out of poverty. So it's not just an issue of getting the ultra poor to shift their consumption from the current state to a slightly improved state when there is the cash transfers. The issue is how do they actually improve even upon the state that they get to with the cash transfers and then sustain that improvement. And that is essentially what the graduation approach tries to do. And so it's indeed involves how you can actually improve the capacity as well as the ability of the ultra poor so that not only should they be able to generate income on a sustainable basis, but also the other dimensions of poverty then will be improved with respect to the ultra poor, i.e. become more socially as well as economically more included. Now the graduation program as it is has 6 components, a consumption component, an asset component, a financial inclusions component, a training components, and encouragement component, as well as health components. And the idea being that all these components, if they are tackled, they can then work together to better position the poor to become more resilient in terms of actually getting out of poverty, but also withstanding the shocks that do happen, and both idiosyncratic as well as covariate shocks that will poor households will face in terms of their livelihoods. Now, in terms of the consumption support, the idea is that the consumption support or the typical cash transfer programs aims to smoothen consumption of these relatively poor households and then help them to meet their basic needs. But the challenge is that, and the evidence seems to suggest that, well, it is kind of missed, but the sustainability has question marks in terms of the evidence. And so the idea then is that if you added, say, an asset which helps in the diversification of the livelihoods of the poor, that will mean a more sustainable engagement of the ultra poor in profitable livelihoods. Also to help the poor or insulate them against adverse shocks, they need to become more financially included, which then can help reduce their vulnerability to the adverse shocks. And indeed also the improvements in savings can help in terms of the access to credits. Of course, there is the issue of capacity of the ultra poor in terms of undertaking productive activities. And so training is important. And indeed, the management of their assets as well as general economic activities that they engage in and how they manage it. Again, training them so that they become better at improving upon the management aspect of their businesses is important. Then also, of course, for the ultra poor, again, sustaining the push in terms of improving their livelihoods can be quite challenging. And so again, the encouragement required of these models and how you actually then increasingly and on a constant basis help these households to overcome some of the short-term shocks, if you like, that they meet every day, or short-term problems, and troubleshooting some of these short-term problems over time is important. But also one of the quite idiosyncratic shocks has to do with health, which translates into hygiene, and of course, again, nutrition, which also has implications for the poverty reduction generally. And again, an intra-generational poverty reduction. And so again, training in basic health, hygiene, and nutrition so that the poor households can, at very low cost, improve their malnutrition, and then also help the other aspects that affects livelihoods generally becomes quite important. So the graduation program essentially is looking at all these components and then saying that if we really want to make sustainable gains in terms of improving the livelihoods of the poor, let us tackle these different components and again, help the poor. Okay, so the question then is that what does the evidence say with respect to these graduation programs? Now, there is a study by Abegit et al. In the Science, which is based on a randomized control trial for 6 countries, Ghana, Ethiopia, Honduras, India, Pakistan, and Peru. And essentially, this program targets the poorest of the poor, and the design was such that they actually did try as much as possible to get to the ultra poor households in these 6 countries. And the evidence exposed with respect to the targeting shows that overall the selected households were actually quite poor relative to what actually pertains in this or in these countries. So about 48% of the selected households had their per capita consumption below $1.25 compared to 19% for the sample as a whole. Now, what this study did was actually to undertake this consumption support and asset transfers in the first 12 months. And then following that, they actually undertook an endline survey, which enabled the evaluation at the end of 24 months, that is 12 months after the transfer, the asset transfer had been done and after the consumption support had stopped. And then again, 36 months after, where there was actually no activity at all, they actually undertook another data collection, which enabled evaluation over a longer term on what the impact of the graduation program was. So they actually evaluated all the 6 different arms that I discussed to be able to tell whether A, the program had an impact, and B, whether that impact was could be sustained even after the program had stopped. The main results, again, shows that generally in terms of, and here I've just chosen just a few slides to present the results. Per capita consumption improved compared to the mean control, both at the first end line or the second end line, and compared to the mean of about $78 per head per month, the increase was about 4.55 US dollars at PPP. So this consumption was positive and significant, and I think the impact also persisted after 1 year after the program had actually stopped. In terms of food security, again, same thing was observed for all the countries, although of course there is heterogeneity across the 6 different countries, with some countries having significantly higher impact than others. Again, in terms of the asset index, the value of assets of households, again, the study does find a significant impact on these ultra-poor households. Again, importantly, in the first end line as well as the second end line, that is after 24 months and then after 36 months, you still find a positive impact of the program on the value of assets of the poor households. So generally what this study is showing is that a big push or more comprehensive effort, even if it's over a short period, can lead to positive outcomes. And in a sense, the positive outcomes can begin, or at least the evidence shows that we begin to see the unlocking of the poverty trap for these ultra-poor households. And so sustainability is quite important. And indeed, I think it's fair to say that even though the average impact, particularly with respect to the consumption, is not great, the fact that it is still significant is important. And I think that the bottom line with respect to these graduation models and the evidence is that cash transfers alone may not be the most optimal way of actually tackling ultra-poor households if we really want to get households out of poverty in a sustainable manner. Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah, and thank you very much, Robert. That was a wonderful and informative overview. So I don't think Andrew has been able to join us, so I'll continue in my moderator role. So Sam, would you like to share with us now what you and the BOMA project have been doing around these sorts of livelihood building programs?
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks once again for inviting me to share our experience and perspective around poverty graduation. And I'm more than happy to present this from a practitioner's perspective. So at the BOMA project, we are looking at promoting women's resilience in the Africa arid regions. Our programming our graduation approach is basically targeted to communities and populations that live within the drylands of Africa. And what we do really is to implement an enterprise-based approach, what we call the Rural Entrepreneur Access Project, or invariously referred to as REAP, which is a really high impact and gender-focused poverty graduation model. This model works at the nexus of climate change, gender inequality, and extreme poverty, because we really target the populations, first of all, who are prone to high risks, especially the climate risk and the other secondary risks that come with that. And more importantly, also the disproportionate population category who are disproportionately affected, which includes women, girls, and even youth. And what we've seen over the time is that the methodology that we have applied through this model has resulted into building long-lasting resilience through addressing the key dimensions of poverty, which, as have been enumerated by Robert, revolves around income and savings, productive assets, agency, personal agency, as well as vulnerability to shocks. So far, over the last 12 years, we've basically been domiciled in Kenya. And in Kenya, we've been working within northeastern Kenya, which is also the epicenter of drought and drought effects. And through this, we've been able to adapt our model and evolve it accordingly to address the pertinent or the underlying drivers of risk vulnerabilities. To this effect, we've been able to build in components progressively to address aspects of health, address aspects of nutrition, address aspects of conservation and natural resource management, and also issues around conflict. So the lessons that we've learned through these operations in northern Kenya, we've been able to also export the same to other arid and semi-arid zone 2, which are taking us to other lowlands within Kenya, of course, with subsequent adaptations to meet the contextualized challenges within those locations. I would also want to mention that that approach has been recognized by the government, who have invited us to work together to build in an economic inclusion program that embeds both the graduation approach and the government cash transfer programs to build in a more high impact intervention to address the challenges of these populations. Because of these lessons that we've learned now across 11 counties in Kenya, we have also moved out to Uganda. And in Uganda, and specifically, we are working in the northeastern Uganda as well as parts of western Uganda to try and address the extreme poor through this graduation model. Further on, we've also moved to the Sahel in partnership with other organizations, specifically Caritas Switzerland, to implement our model within the Sahel region, and looking forward to expanding that to Mali, Burkina Faso, and other neighboring countries. So our model is a little different from the traditional graduation model. As you know, most graduation models begin with consumption stipends. After identification, they do consumption stipends. Then they begin with savings. For the RIP model, because we target the extreme poor, the ultra poor actually in that subcategory, we begin our program with grants or asset transfer to support the establishment of a livelihood enterprise. And this granting follows an elaborate identification or targeting process, which includes the 2 steps that were that were explained by Robert. So we undertake a PRA process to select eligible participants, and then we apply a modified PPI scorecard, what we call participant targeting tool, to be able to narrow down to the right household or the right individual who should be enrolled into the program. Then that is followed, of course, by training, and this is looking at both business and life skills, and then 2 years of mentorship and coaching, opening up of savings, and then connecting with financial and market opportunities. I would want to say, for example, that our mentorship also forms, I would say, forms the core of success of the program as we see it, because it then creates the difference of one-off intervention and provides an opportunity for handholding and coaching of these communities to prepare them to lift off to the next level. So far, we have seen 145, this percent increase in terms of income. We've seen growth in terms of income. We have seen exponential increase in savings, food consumption, no children going to bed hungry or at least having 2 meals a day. And then also, of course, longevity, conducted longevity studies after 5 and 7 years and realized that 81% of the enterprises that we support are still in existence and functioning at profitable scale. So I just wanted to illustrate, really, give you this illustration to show you how the steps look like. And like I stated, we begin with the targeting, and then we follow that up with a cash transfer or asset transfer, which supports the establishment of the enterprise. And we do a group approach because we also consider the time poverty for the women who are involved in the program. So the group approach enables us to have great accountability, help us to share roles and responsibilities so that some of these women also are able to attend to other household needs, which also requires their attention. Implementing a very robust financial literacy and business skills training, and then supporting a second conditional grant transfer, savings and credit, and assessment of the outcome of that intervention at the end of 24 months, where we look at food security, sustainable livelihoods, we look at shock preparedness through savings accumulation, and also human capital investments, which includes increased urgency, household decision-making capacity, and enrollment of specifically the girl child in school. So our conventional model runs for 24 months, but over time and with the lessons that we've done, we are looking at, we've been implementing shorter pilots. For example, we are currently implementing a 16-month model, and we want to see how whether we can get the same level of impact within a shorter time. And we have even moved further to now implement a 12 months, but targeting a specific demography of vulnerable youth population within the arid and semi-arid lands. Also, with the evidence that we have got, we understand, and I think Robert has mentioned this, that graduation in its pure sense is good, but in most cases, it leaves the populations at the edge. So we require to also look at the other key sectors that are of importance to the livelihoods of this population. And to that effect, we have explored ways in which we can build onto our graduation model to layer or to achieve nutritional outcomes, to support addressing the acute persistent malnutrition as is experienced within Northern Kenya. We have also built in, modules that are addressing natural resource management to also build in environmental benefits out of the graduation intervention. We have built in health because we target women at a greater percentage, and we are looking at how does graduation, for example, form the foundation of addressing, reproductive health concerns, as well as general access to health through maybe health insurance schemes. So in summary, graduation indeed has proven to be very, very impactful, specifically for the populations that live in these risk-prone areas. And more importantly, the sequential nature of graduation model provides an opportunity to also adapt as we move along, and also an opportunity for coaching and hand-holding to make sure that the benefits are long-lasting by the time the program exits. I believe that will be all for now, and I'll be happy to take up any questions when we get to that point. Over to you, Prof. Thank you.
Okay, Sam, thank you. Thank you very much. And that was a great compliment to what Robert shared with us as well. So I'm going to talk just a little bit in an effort to complement what we've just heard about integrating asset building and asset protection to address chronic poverty programs. So I'm going to start off thinking from sort of a high altitude from a theoretical perspective. So I want to talk a little bit about what if we think about social protection in dynamic perspective. So social protection programs, and especially cash transfer programs, often focus only on the people who are already poor. But if we take a step back and think about the dynamics that generated that kind of poverty, we might ask questions such as the following. So how did people become as poor as they are? So Robert, for example, told us that in his 6-country study, there's a very large number of people living on less than $1.25 a day. So how did people end up in that circumstance? And second, and related to that first question, is the question, is it cheaper and more effective to help prevent people descending into poverty rather than waiting for them to descend into poverty and then try to treat it with cash transfers? So in other words, is an ounce of prevention worth a pound of cure, if you will, when you think about the poverty problem? So together actually with Sarah Jansen, who's on the call with us, and several other co-authors, we put together a book called The Economics of Poverty Traps. And in that, one of the things that we did is sort of use a dynamic economic model to perform a thought experiments on different ways of addressing deep and chronic poverty. So the thought experiment works as follows. We imagine that you have a government that has a fixed social protection budget. And instead of simply spending that fixed budget on cash transfers to people who happen to initially be poor, suppose the government implements an alternative kind of policy which prioritizes expenditures in the following order. So the first priority is asset protection. So that is, instead of spending money on cash transfers, you protect the assets of the vulnerable people who are not necessarily poor, but who've suffered a shock. And you can think about this as taking place through contingent transfers. So Kenya, for example, has a contingent transfer program called HSNP2. HSNP stands for Hunger Safety Net Program. And the transfers are contingent in the sense that the size and magnitude of the transfers and eligibility for the transfers depend on an index which signals when there's been a shock that's destroyed people's assets. You could also implement this kind of asset protection through a more conventional insurance contract. And we'll be talking actually about both, I think, as we go through. The second priority in this thought experiment is asset building. So again, rather than spending money on cash transfers, what if you instead do the sort of thing that Robert and Sam have told us about, and you focus on the livelihoods of the poor and building up their assets so that hopefully they can eventually graduate from poverty. And then the third priority in this thought experiment is actually to do something more conventional, that is to use any remaining money after these first two priorities are met to spend money on needs-based transfer. That is, you try to close the poverty gap for people who are poor at that moment. Now, what comes out of this analysis is what we call the paradox of social protection. And the paradox of social protection is notice, this triage policy is actually in the first instance prioritizing expenditure of money on people who might be near poor, but are not themselves the poorest people in the society. And what we try to show in this analysis is that by thinking about the dynamics of poverty and how people became poor and how they might become poor, you can actually do better for poor people. So these two diagrams come from the paradox, come from the Economics of Poverty Trap book. And what they show us here is the results from a dynamic simulation. I won't go into any of those details. The horizontal axis in these diagrams represent simulated years. The diagram on the left is measuring poverty headcount. The downward sloping blue line, solid blue line here, is poverty headcount under the triage policy, this prioritization that I just described in detail. And what we can see is over time, we start with a society that has almost a 40% headcount rate of poverty. And after around 40, 50 years in the simulation, that headcount rate has fallen to 20 to 25%. So quite a decline. And the other lines are what happens if you simply either do nothing or you simply give cash money to try to close the poverty gap for those people who happen to be poor at any particular point in time. And then the diagram on the right displays the results from the same simulation, but instead of looking at the number of people that are poor, measures the average depth of poverty for poor people. And here you see something kind of interesting. So this dotted reddish orange line is actually the poverty gap. So the depth of poverty for people who are poor at any point in time when you pursue the conventional sort of needs-based or cash transfer approach. And again, the solid blue line here is what we see when we pursue a policy that actually does not prioritize the poor with a fixed budget, but instead prioritizes the changing the dynamic processes of poverty. And what you see is in the simulation for about 8 or 9 years, if you knew you were going to be a poor person, you'd rather have a policy that prioritizes you. But after that point in time, if you were going to be a poor person, you'd actually say, well, I would actually be better off in a society where the prioritization for social protection is to change poverty dynamics rather than simply prioritizing people who are already poor. So the paradox, as we call it, of social protection is that if you think about the dynamics of where poverty come from, there's a very strong public case for using scarce money, that public funding that might be available, to spend that money on asset building and asset protection, rather than simply prioritizing it in sort of band-aid operations. Granted, people are in desperate situations and need support. So the argument here is that a program can potentially be more effective. And this paradox of social protection is working out the way it does because there's a vulnerability reduction effect. So notice when we don't take on this kind of multifaceted policy of asset protection and asset building, the number of people who are poor creeps up over time simply because of the dynamic process. But by providing asset protection, we cut off that inflow of newly poor people. There's also the asset transfer effect. And finally, by providing people protection for their assets in the kind of model that we use, that incentivizes people to invest even more. So if we move from that sort of abstract theoretical analysis, I think the logic that it's really capturing is that there's a synergistic combination of asset building and asset protection that can really work in the context of graduation program. So I like to shift now from these theoretical musings to actually thinking about what the empirical literature tells us. So Robert and Sam both have given us a really great introduction to what happens when you try to improve people's livelihoods and build assets. Now, they both emphasize what you might call average treatment effects. So Sam gave us quite impressive numbers on what the BOMA's REAP program has done in terms of raising people's income and savings. And Robert did the same thing for a 6-country study. If you start looking beyond the averages, though, there's something I've started calling the rule of 40%. So if you look in what's called conditional quantile analysis or quantile treatment effects, we're finding that particularly in a medium term, that roughly 40% of the beneficiaries of graduation programs are not benefiting at all. And 60% are actually benefiting much more than the average treatment effect, which we described earlier, is suggesting. So the question is, why this heterogeneity? Why do these programs, which on average are very effective, why are they so heterogeneous in their impacts? And there's sort of two, I think, candidate explanations, both of which I believe are actually quite important. One is that there's probably heterogeneity in the shocks that people receive. Robert showed us in his 6-country study summary, he showed us that Honduras, one of the countries in the study, the impacts were actually negligible. And if you dig into that a little bit, and Robert can tell us more about this, there was actually a very large shock that came along and very much did damage and destroyed the assets that had been transferred to the beneficiaries of the program in Honduras. But more generally, if you think about a place like northern Kenya, which Sam showed us a lot of pictures, thinking about that arid landscape, that's an area of high risk. Every few years, there can be extreme weather events that do damage to families' livelihoods. So one question is, how much of the heterogeneity of the impact is actually heterogeneous experience of shocks? And our 20 to 40% of households actually, maybe they're on a graduation trajectory to improve their livelihoods, but something bad comes along. The other theoretically important thing, and I'll just say a tiny bit about it here, is that standard graduation programs tend to offer a package. So they offer a level of tangible or physical assets to people. And they also offer a package of mentoring or coaching, which you can, I think, conceptualize as trying to improve the psychological assets of individuals. In a couple of studies that we've been doing now, we see that a lot of that heterogeneity is actually coming from both of these two sources, but just to focus on the second one, in two ongoing studies, one actually in Peru, the other in northern Kenya, that's in collaboration with the BOMA project that Sam represents. We find if we take the beneficiaries of the program and we divide them in half, so take the half of people who begin with a lower measure of agency or a lower level of mental health and confidence at baseline, and then we compare them to people who started off in a sort of, let's just call it a psychologically more self-confident state, we find that simply splitting the population in that direction, and we can do the same thing, by the way, in the control group in both of these countries, we find that people in the top half are getting 2 to 3 times the benefit out of the program than the people who started off in a psychologically weaker circumstance. Now, that by itself is not particularly surprising, but it does suggest that as we look at a population, we need to realize that poverty has had damages people, not only in terms of their living standards, but also in their own self-confidence, their own belief in their self-efficacy and agency. And if you don't have any confidence in your ability to shape your future, then giving someone in that circumstance a new opportunity does not have much impact. So let's then think about the second issue just a little bit more, which is heterogeneity and the impact of these programs that is maybe generated by shocks. So as I mentioned, we're working with Sam and his colleagues in the BOMA project. And what we're doing is, and this is why it's really unfortunate Andrew Mude did not join us this year, was unable to join us today. Andrew was one of the motors behind creating the index-based livestock insurance program in the same general area of Kenya that Sam shared with us. Their prior impact evaluations, Sam already shared with us some of the results on BOMA's REAP program. Similarly, analyses of the index-based livestock insurance program suggested that program also has significant impacts on family well-being. So what we've done is say, well, maybe we can make a more durable, a more sustainable impact on poverty if we combine the asset building approach of BOMA's REAP program with the asset protection approach of IBLI. So we're actually right now in about year 3.5 or 4, I guess it must be almost by now, of a large-scale randomized controlled trial where we're looking at the synergies between combining the BOMA program together with the index-based livestock insurance program that was originally developed by the International Livestock Research Institute in collaboration with a number of us. So the overall, we're trying to see if we can make a larger impact on poverty. Can we protect not only the already poor, but also keep the vulnerable non-poor that who aren't poor initially? Can we actually keep them from falling into poverty? And there's a few other bells and whistles in the study, but I won't bother to mention those here. So here's the basic study outline. We started back in 2018. There are different waves of treatment. There was a major drought shock that came along in 2019, and we're coming back here in just about a year from now to do the next follow-up or end-line survey. The results we have so far show that the REAP program itself is having large impacts on assets, on income, gives a large return on investment. We also find that this shock that occurred really deeply cut into the impact of the REAP program on women's assets. So it almost erased it. So those households that experienced a drought shock in 2019, the assets that women were building up in the REAP program get cut away. We're also still looking at the impact of the index-based livestock insurance. Did it actually offset that negative consequence of shocks? We are finding evidence that it does, but again, we're still working on it. And we find evidence that it does offset it, but that latter result is not statistically significant. So I don't want to oversell it at the present moment. So my final comment then is one that I think is really important in the real world here, which is the challenge of making index insurance relevant to women. So as it says here on the slide, only some risks are actually indexable and can be insured by index insurance. So the insurance contract we're using in northern Kenya is based on satellite readings of forage growth on the rangelands. Now, that's a huge risk to families in this area, but the transhumanist pastoralism, which is most affected in a direct way by forage growth, is culturally seen as a male activity. So the question is, if you offer an insurance contract that ensures the income generation of men, of an income process that's controlled by men, does that actually resonate and make sense to women? And this has been a concern since we launched this. So what we've done and what we're moving forward with is the idea of making clear to women that they have an indirect exposure to risk. And it doesn't take much convincing. So talking to women in this area, they very much understand that there's intra-household risk shifting. That is when, if their husbands are off and suffer a severe rangeland shock, those women know that the transfers that come back to them to take care of their families begin to diminish. And in turn, this is what diminishes their own assets. So the finding we're already seeing that women's business assets are damaged by rangeland shocks, I think makes a lot of sense. And you don't have to really convince women of that. So what we did in an experimental game was we changed the framing of the livestock insurance to a household insurance, which simply, it's the same contract and it was truthfully presented as a rangeland insurance, but simply was marketed, if you will, in the context of making clear to women their indirect exposure to this kind of risk. So in the game, and I won't bother to try to explain the diagram, the reframing of the insurance had a huge impact on women's demand for index insurance. It basically doubled it. And so based on that experience, we're now moving forward to actually implement this in practice. So I'm hoping to be joining Sam and our colleagues in index insurance in Kenya actually next week to begin to see how we can actually take this reframing, and we hope to incorporate it more intrinsically into the BOMA business model so that they can not only build up women's assets but protect them against shocks. So I just wanted to close there, and we can move on now, since I guess I'm still playing both roles. Let's move on now to Federica. Federica, as I mentioned before, works for the Africa Risk Capacity, which is playing a really interesting and I think complementary role in this space. So Federica, please take us away.
Okay. Hi everyone, first of all. Coming after Michael is a great introduction because you mentioned already insurance, parametric insurance and index-based insurance. And I think I can lean on common sense and your common logic when I say that all these social protection programs do actually have a highest impact and maximize their effectiveness if they can rely on a consistency of resources and if they can be made available over time. So the role of insurance that I would like to explain better today is to provide this sort of reliability and consistency over time of this type of resources without having to allocate higher than necessary resources to face risks that might not happen in the end. Is again appealing to the logic, is the principle of investment, not to leave sitting resources and money without the necessary to spend it. So what the concept of the African risk capacity, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but I'm just briefly introduce it, is an African Union specialized agency that provides African member states, which are currently 33 signatory of the treaty, with parametric insurance, currently against drought and tropical cyclone, in the pipeline also against flood perils and outbreaks and epidemics as well. And the concept of parametric insurance is to link satellite rainfall data, at least for drought at the moment, is to link satellite rainfall data to early warning system and operational responses. So what it translates, and Michael before mentioned it for the HSMP program, which is linked to in Kenya, which is linked to an index, the satellite data are converted into a meaningful drought indexes. It can be water requirement satisfaction index, as in the case of ARC. It can be standardized precipitation index. It can be VCI, as in the case of Kenya, which is the vegetation condition index. It can be different indexes, but the most important feature of these indexes is that they are real time, and they can, once categorized by the country, once categorized and customized by each country to reflect the reality on the ground. The drought index main feature is that it's real time, and assuming it's not affected by basis risks, so that it's correct, reflecting the severity of the drought on the ground. It is automatic. So it doesn't require any decision. Moreover, not any political decision, any appeal for funds, anything. It just automatically triggers funds that are pre-allocated by the insurance company. So if you see the time scale, sorry, the time before the harvest, when the index is composed by collecting and accumulating and compounding satellite data, then we are able to provide funds to trigger a payout in few months, which is still quite a not negligible amount of time, but the response coming in 4 months is less than a third of the usual amount of time needed for a disaster to be fully, for a disaster response be fully funded. If it comes through the normal mechanism of appealing for funds, of allocating funds, of designing the response and so on. Now, can you go to the next slide, please? Now we have as an African risk capacity, but also in general as parametric insurance, there's been a lot of studies for the cost benefits, to analyze the cost and benefits of this type of mechanisms. And one very striking reality that came out of many different insurance programs, as well as ARC analyzed, was that the most effective response that this mechanism can put in place to optimize the resources and maximize the impact on the ground and the benefits for the beneficiaries is to scale up what is already there. What are the existing safety nets program? Now, the example of Kenya is also very actual to ARC, because we have implemented, although Kenya didn't participate to ARC risk pool, we did design a response program which was basically based on the scale up of the hunger safety net program, the HSMP, sorry, program. And it was based on not only scaling up in terms of number of beneficiaries, but also in terms of additional counties, which is a bit more difficult logistically, but as well, since it can benefit of the same structure, it would be a quicker response than implementing any other intervention. So what is the most distinguishing feature of mechanisms like ARC is that countries that participate to the risk pool have to predefine the interventions that they plan to use the payments, the payouts for. So that is what we call a contingency plan that needs to be pre-approved by the ARC board and by all countries member of the treaty. And in these contingency plans, all activities that will be undertaken are outlined. So it can be for food distribution, school feeding, so different scenarios, and with all attached different speed of delivery from the harvest time to response. But what is most interesting in this context and what is proved to be the most effective solution was to scaling up what is existing on the ground again. Existing safety nets such as cash transfer, voucher programs, public works programs is the quickest and most effective response. On the longer run, assuming that would require a commitment of the government, which is a longer term commitment. The ideal solution would be to ensure government budgets for insurance scheme for state subsidized agriculture, but that would require again a long-term commitment that is very difficult to practically have. Next slide, please. So what we learned through after 8 years now of ARC rolling out and deployment in Africa is that in practice the payout implementation is delayed because of payout reception from the national treasury, which is very pragmatical problems. The transfer of funds do not follow the disasters, so not necessarily the budget cycle. So procedurally it's very difficult and can be funding flows can be hampered by from the central treasury. But although the most important lesson learned that we have is that although social protection, as I was saying before, are often limited geographically to the most vulnerable communities and not easily scalable in disaster situation to reach out beneficiaries that might fall under the poverty line or might become most vulnerable because of the disaster. What has been demonstrating as the most effective use of insurance payout is scaling up existing safety net programs. Still, the concept of insurance has a limited understanding. It's still a young concept of this early funding for early action. So different actors on the ground and in multilateral stakeholders perceive it in a different way. But the years after years of implementations is converging this understanding, fortunately. But again, it's a very early concept. And moreover, as I was mentioning at the beginning, we're still struggling with basis risk, which is the other face of the coin of early action. And early action is allowed by the use of satellite data, which is real-time and objective and transparent, but not being observed on the ground and proved in practice. It's affected by what we call in insurance jargon basis risk. So it might not be fully correct, and it might lead to different severity of drought detection. I mean, severity of the impact actually perceived on the ground. So I hope I convey the message of the insurance mechanism benefit in the social protection, to sustain social protection systems and eventually scale it up. I'm open to question, and I hope I wasn't that boring in talking as last speaker.
Okay, great. Thank you, Federica. That was really interesting, and I think it's important to bring the discussion of what you and ARC are doing into this conversation about livelihoods and social protection. So I kept hoping that Andrew Mude would magically appear, but he has not, which is unfortunate. But I guess, Ermias, this is the point in time in which we can open up to discussion, and perhaps what we can do is Sarah Jansen is our sort of, I think she's our only sort of featured commentator. So Sarah, as you listen to these, were there things you would like to add to the conversations or questions you would like to ask? Then thank you very much for joining us.
Nothing like putting me on the spot there, Michael.
That's okay. That's what they pay me the big bucks to do.
No, I mean, I think this was actually a really, really nice summary of where I think things stand in the literature. So, you know, Robert provided a really nice introduction, I think, of what has come out of the work on the BRAC graduation programs. And I think one thing that I'll highlight out of Robert's presentation was kind of in that concluding remarks, you know, it seems like these programs are working. If you do the cost benefit, it seems like they work, right? The benefits exceed the costs. But there is this concern, and I've seen this in my own research of similar graduation programs, that even if it's cost effective by our typical metrics of cost effectiveness, it doesn't seem like it's having this transformative effect of really bringing people out of poverty in the way we think of, you know, movement out of a poverty trap. And I think sometimes that conclusion out of that science paper gets overlooked. And so I appreciate that Robert was willing to bring that up. I also appreciated the perspective that Sam provided in terms of, you know, as a real practitioner on the ground with this experience in the BOMA project. And I think he highlighted further this same concern in thinking about the heterogeneity, which you also highlighted in your presentation, Michael, thinking about, you know, these average treatment effects that are emphasized in a lot of the literature, even in some of my own work in this area, can sometimes be misleading. And I think we really, if we want to understand that, that finding that I just brought up from Robert of like who is benefiting from these programs, we need to unpack those average treatment effects further and think about that heterogeneity analysis. So I appreciate that. I think both you, Michael, and Sam highlighted that. And then part of that, I think, as you brought up, is this concern about risk and vulnerability. There are, I think, a few studies that I've seen thinking about these kinds of programs in super risky areas. And you can define those risky areas in different ways, right? So Sam's BOMA project is working in northern Kenya, which is really drought prone. So that kind of risk. I'm currently working with the World Bank on a project that they're trying to implement in Yemen, which is a totally different kind of risky environment. It's hard to say how well these programs will work in that kind of context, which I think is a gap in the literature as well. But thinking about kind of insurance in that kind of context in Yemen, where the risks are very different from, say, drought insurance, where like the ARC kind of program or whatever we're calling it would work. You know, you can't use satellite-based imagery to create an insurance that in the context of conflict in the same way, I think. So that's something to think about too, is how do we deal with those contexts? I think that's probably enough comments from me. I think that was more of a summary than anything else, but hopefully a highlighting of some of the points that I think are really important.
Thank you, Sarah. Maybe we can ask Robert and then Sam just to reflect on your summary around, are these programs really transformative? And perhaps they have some ideas on things that could be done to make them more transformative, or maybe they disagree with your characterization. But Robert, maybe starting with you, do you have some thoughts?
Okay, thank you. I think that's, again, Sarah re-echoes the point that I tried to highlight, which is that these programs are by no means transformative, at least not what the evidence shows for now. However, I think that the other side is also important to bring up, which is that increasingly many of the particularly African countries have gone into overdrive with respect to social protection, particularly cash transfer programs. And in large part, I think the evidence is very mixed, and I think it's probably tilted more towards limited sustainable impacts, particularly from a consumption point. And so whilst it's not transformative, as of now, we haven't seen that evidence, and I think we need to work harder to better understand how we can actually, in a more transformative way, get the ultra poor out of poverty. But it's still quite important in the sense that on a sustainable basis, we are actually finding that this program is impacting. And I agree that the impacts are heterogeneous, even from the cross-country evidence. We do see differences in terms of how it has actually impacted in different countries. And one should not attempt to try and then pick out these individual country differences and then highlight on them. But I think the point is that the context within which the programs are actually implemented does matter. So if you ask me the simple question, is the graduation model a better model than what we currently are pursuing? My very straightforward answer is absolutely yes. Has it been as transformative as we would like to see? Probably the evidence doesn't necessarily point to that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. So Sam, do you have any thoughts? And I'm going to put a particular question to you as well, that you might want to work in, or you can, of course, avoid the question if you prefer. But I remember a few years ago, I was having a conversation with a man named Munsi Suleiman, who's been very vital, actually working with the NGO Brock, which actually started the whole graduation program. And he told me in an aside on a conference that he actually thought the reason graduation programs work is because of the intensive mentoring and what he called the hand-holding. And I know, Robert, both you and Sam actually used the word hand-holding, I believe, in here, but this very intensive and also very expensive. I mean, we didn't really talk about this here, but you know, both the REAP program that Sam runs and Robert in the studies that you've been involved with, when you actually break down the cost structure of these programs, they're often almost evenly split, in my memory, between the money spent on tangible assets that people can have versus money spent on mentoring. And so, Sam, as you sort of think about heterogeneity, and it might be interesting since you're a practitioner, do you have that sort of gut from on the ground feeling about the relative importance of mentoring versus tangible assets, or, you know, again, your thoughts would be welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof. And also thank you, Sarah, for really those great insights. To begin with, you, Prof, mentorship and coaching forms the core of graduation programming. And it is also the differentiator from implementation of other safety net programs. Because of the really deserving state of the populations targeted by poverty graduation, they really need that consistent support in order to be able to grow and meet the milestones that have been, you know, set for the graduation program. But more importantly, they need that mentorship and coaching to support and walk them through the journey of transformation. Indeed, you're very right. Mentorship and coaching also forms the core of the cost. It is the most expensive component of graduation, but also the most critical component to bring the transformative effect that we all want. And mentorship, if you look at it really, for it even to be effective, it needs to be implemented or undertaken by a person who really understands the context, the characteristics of the targeted individuals or participants, and also understand the household dynamics so that they're able to address the other you know, aspects around psychological assets, other aspects around market dynamics, and therefore incomes and savings, and also basically household performance or participant performance as far as the management of the asset transfer is concerned. So I'll tie that to the comment from Sarah around the transformative effect. Indeed, we still need to work hard to generate more evidence around that fact. Nonetheless, we have some intermediate outcomes as well as studies that, you know, have been done. I think we just have one which came out from Bangladesh, you know, which suggested that actually up to around 10 years after cessation of implementation, the people enrolled into the program still exhibited the transformative outcomes that were implemented through graduation. At BOMA, for example, we've done longevity studies at 5 and 7 year time scale, and we've realized that 81% of those who are enrolled, you know, still exhibit and, you know, the outcomes that were realized at the end point of the program. And I believe also some more of this is going to come out from the study that we're implementing with Professor Michael Carter. What is important though is that we need to safeguard the benefits or the outcomes of the graduation at the graduation point. And this is where the question around asset protection through insurance comes in. And the other aspect, which is also critical, is to, you know, answer the question of graduation, then what? Because yes, it is good to graduate them, but how do we keep it? Or how do we link them now to the next level, you know, market dynamics and so on, so that we can sustain the gains and the benefits that have been achieved through that implementation. And to Robert's point, weighing cash transfer vis-a-vis graduation, cash transfers and other safety nets are very critical for supporting response and coping. But if we want to really look at the long-term, you know, effect on sustainability of the security and coping mechanism, then we need to look at a more longer-term strategy, which looks at the fundamentals of the poverty situation that these participants are found in. And finally, for the heterogeneity, one other aspect is getting the targeting right. I think that also has been the strength of the model that we implement, understanding the context, getting the targeting right, and using the right tools to select and filter the right people to get into the graduation programming. Over.
Thank you very much for that. Maybe one thing, maybe I'll just, since I'm trying to wear two hats here and be the moderator and also, you know, I think one thing that's interesting to consider is to what extent does the mentoring and confidence building, and that aspect of mentoring, to what extent does that actually spill over and benefit other people who aren't in the program? So this has implications for how you measure impacts, because if your control group is coming from untreated people and yet they're friends with people in the program, are they actually learning from the people? And Sam, as you know, in the study we're doing with you, we set up what's called in wonk, statistical wonk language, it's called a saturation design. So that in different communities, there are different fractions of the population that have been treated at any point in time. And we're using that variability to judge the spillovers. And our first analysis of that has shown that the spillovers are actually quite substantial. And so women who are not actually in the REAP program seem to be picking up some of the stuff. And we find when we take that spillover, which into consideration, Sarah mentioned benefit cost terms. So it basically increased the benefit cost ratio by about 40 percentage points or 50 percentage points, when we actually said it's being artificially depressed by the fact that the control group has benefited from the program. But the flip side of that, of course, also has to do with and the other reason we've been talking about it, as you know, Sam, is that, what's the density of this kind of very intensive mentoring that's necessary within a community? And so in fact, can you save on some of those resources? So those are things to think about. I want to ask Federica just a second question, sort of linking the micro and macro, but before we go too far away from a couple of things that Sarah said. Sarah, I'm very curious, you mentioned some new work you're doing in Yemen. So the concern there is that the primary shock people are concerned with is actually coming from civil conflict. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think so. Yemen is probably one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world right now. And so if you think about going into this area where even if you're in the more stable parts of the country, which is what they're going to end up doing, just because they weren't able to get approval to work in less stable areas from the local authorities there. But even when you think about going into the more stable areas, I think there's just lots of risks that you can't, it's risks, so you can't anticipate it. And you can't design an insurance contract, I think, at least an index insurance contract, to protect against, say, theft from rebels and things like that. I suppose you could design an insurance contract, but I don't know how you would design, I can't think of an index that would be appropriate. It seems pretty complicated.
Is there any sense there that climate shocks and those pressures are actually or competition over resources in times of droughts, for example, are drivers of crisis and political instability? Or I don't know anything about Yemen, so I'm just asking.
Yeah, I don't know the context as well as I should, but it's a new project, so I'm sure that I will have a lot of time to learn. I think there is evidence that those kind of climate stressors are correlated with shocks, at least in other contexts, with like the conflict shocks in other contexts. Yes.
Well, it'll be just to advertise for, I run this organization called the Basis Markets Risk and Resilience Innovation Lab, and we just funded a new research program, which is going to stretch across northern Kenya and southern Ethiopia. And it's actually investigating the question as to whether the provision of livestock insurance, along with some conflict management mechanisms, will actually reduce the extent of conflict. So how much of the conflict has sort of a material root in climate instability? So this is a project that's being led by Carla. I don't pronounce her name well because she's Dutch. And I always freeze when I see Dutch names. I just see a bunch of unpronounceable letters put together. Carleen Moorsink, I think it's pronounced, at the, I forget which university she's in the Netherlands, and Glenn Harrison, who's at Georgia State. But they're putting together quite a large project over the next 5, 6, 7 years to actually sort of explore this issue. And Sarah, you might remember in the early days of, Sarah also worked on the index-based livestock insurance, but we did a little bit of analysis showing that, people can self-report how they lose assets. So they might lose animals that tip over in drought, and they might lose animals to theft and things like this. And we showed that some of them, even in the case where some of the losses were not directly caused by drought, they often were indirectly, at least pretty strongly correlated with it. So I think that's another, obviously civil conflict can be devastating, and it's got deep and complex roots, but it will be interesting to see if providing a modicum of stability, and this could be, this could actually speak to something like ARC even. And so let me use that as a segue to pass it to Frederica. I mean, in your work, Frederica, do you all think about the role of ARC within the situation of conflict and conflict reduction?
Yeah, to be honest, we've been asked in our history, we've been asked to provide insurance to different kind of perils as well as conflict. I think the most ambitious response that we could give was about the outbreaks and epidemics, which is difficult enough, but for conflicts, we always, we researched a bit, but at least parametric insurance, I would say, is almost not impossible, because I don't like calling things impossible anyway, but really unlikely. And to create an index that can be reflecting conflict situation, even part of them, even the most quantifiable aspects of conflicts, because there was the main difficulties found in practice was to the objectiveness that the objectiveness of the triggers. How would you define a conflict trigger which would make everyone agreeing? The insurers, the reinsurers, which it's something not to underestimate, it's a stakeholder not to underestimate, because they basically dictate the policies, the characteristic of the policies, and of course they insure the potential beneficiaries. There is no common agreement, there is no common definition of a potential trigger for conflict. So conflict-induced disaster relief might be something that we can see as a component, an additional component of a payout, but again, it wouldn't be parametric for sure. It would be indemnization, like an indemnity-based insurance, which would make lose the entire value proposition of insurance. In these cases, since conflict, unlike natural disasters, have a sort of predictability way better than climate forecasts. So then insurance is not the right answer. As simple as that. Insurance is the right answer, the most effective answers for unlikely events, infrequent events, and very hard striking events. Conflicts are once they strike are predictable, and there are no objective and transparent trigger for the start of conflict. So there is an unsolvable system of equations, I would call it in mathematical terms.
Before we shift away from conflict, I don't know, Robert, Sam, do you have any thoughts on that, how it intersects with the work you've been doing?
Not really from my end.
Sam, do you see conflict as a problem in your area? I know we actually had an enumerator who was shot not too long ago. Fortunately, he recovered, but it is a conflict-prone area, as you know.
Yeah, ours is our locations are very conflict-prone. Most of these are resource-based and also basically inter-tribal or inter-clan animosities, Once in a while, we have them impacting the program directly. And therefore, as part of our mentorship modules, we've also built in conflict resolution, conflict prevention, and management modules to just try and train women on how to approach some of these issues, basically with a lens of prevention and resolution. But yes, we really do not have direct intervention that targets conflict per se.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I know one thing that motivates this new study I mentioned is that the sense that when rainfall condition, when there are drought pressures and when forage growth is bad, this tends to lead people to expand the range that they might normally cover as they search for forage for their animal. And the further out they move from sort of home, so to speak, the more likely they'll run into the territory of another clan or ethnic group who doesn't particularly appreciate them encroaching on their rangeland areas, especially in a time of drought. So anyway, so switching gears a little bit, perhaps, I wanted to come back, Frederica, to you and put out an idea or what I see as a challenge. So, you gave us very much a macro perspective and suggested, interestingly, that ARC's experience is suggesting that using this additional flow of funds to expand or fortify an existing social safety networks is maybe what's most effective. A lot of the other work we've described is very much more at the household and the micro level. So, my assets, are they built? Are my assets, are they protected? And certainly the work that's been done on index-based livestock or insurance, agricultural insurance in general, at the individual level, often identifies pretty powerful incentive effects. So farmers that have good insurance actually increase their level of investment pretty remarkably. So there was a study done in Robert's country. Robert, maybe you were part of the study actually, looking at maize farmers in Ghana, that found that when people had insurance, they boosted investment by 20%, 30% in terms of the inputs they put into their activity. And there's probably about 5 to 10 other studies that have similar kinds of findings. I guess one of the challenges is if part of the benefit of insurance has been, that if I want to make additional investments and I'm insured, I feel protected and therefore I will make those investments. Do you think there's a way that a macro or sort of sovereign level insurance like ARC does, do you have any ideas, or is ARC thinking about ways to connect all the way down to individuals so that they have the kinds of security that might allow them to make investments and put themselves on more of a entrepreneurial or growth pathway?
Yeah, well, I think it all comes down to the reliability of government programs, how these households that are under, let's say, Kenya, the Hunger Safety Net program, can rely on being in that program for longer term and consistently over time. If they're part of the program and they know that the country has signed up for insurance with a sovereign insurance scheme like ARC, for instance, which is a macro level, then they know that whenever a drought strikes or any other disaster that is insured strikes, the funds will go directly to them as part of the programs. Most difficult will be for those in counties that are not part of the current programs, and they would require to be targeted. And that is beyond the insurance control, because the funds are disbursed to government directly. But as I was saying in my presentation, what a very strict commitment that the country must have before signing up for a risk pool is a contingency plan. And the contingency plan are public, so that every household can have access to, well, not directly maybe, but every county can have access to this contingency plan and be potentially targeted if a drought, the severity of a certain level strikes is identified by the drought index. So even if not already part of the program, which would be more or less being at the same level of a micro insurance, because just through the governments, but the household know that they are part of the program. For those that are currently in normal years outside of the safety net social protection programs, the potentiality of being targeted can be reflected in contingency plans. This is one way, but of course it's a bit not really direct for households. What we are doing as well, or on top of studying different risk layering approaches and going to meso micro level as well, is partnering with what we call our replica partners. And the partners that are part of the replica program, in very few words, they replicate the risk of the country, transfer to ARC, and in case of a drought, they receive the drought payout as well, and they implement it in the way they are designed for. And in this among these replica partners, we have micro insurance schemes like R4 the World Food Program micro insurance scheme, the STAR network, which is as well contingency funds or micro insurance schemes as well. So through ARC, funds can be channeled to household directly through our replica partners. And that's, I think, the two, these and through the safety net program are the most direct ways we have to reach the households.
Okay.
Within our schemes.
I think that's a really interesting idea. It's again, I just got a side note from Andrew Mude. Something came up and he's extremely apologetic and feels terrible, but it's too bad he's not here, because I was riding in a car back from Isiola with Andrew, and when our heads weren't bouncing up against the roof of the car, we were actually trying to talk about ways that you could you do a risk layering approach somehow and have a micro insurance that sits on top of an ARC-like protection, so that ARC can create the premium value to make the market, which would be really important, but then let people actually scale up so that they have certainty that if I'm a REAP businesswoman in Sam's program, I can actually buy some incremental units. So because I now have additional assets at risk, and I need to protect those, and I may well be willing to do that. But if that market is made based on a ARC sort of sovereign level premium load, I think that would be fantastic. And remote sensing obviously makes that quite possible to downscale insurance zones for individual purchase. So I think that's a challenge. Maybe people like yourself who are working more at the macro level, and those of us who are working more at the micro level, maybe we can find a way to make that happen. So Ermias, you've been maybe I can open up to you, or I don't know if there's any others in the room that might have questions, but do you have anything you'd like to add to the conversation?
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I was just wondering, and sort of what would it take to sort of expand? I mean, I've seen this really on the ground work with the BOMA project, for example. So how do you make it larger and sort of cover a much larger area, and what needs to happen to be able to get to that stage?
Yeah. Sam, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, good question, Amias. So we have three basically strategic pathways. One is to implement it directly as BOMA, but we know that would be the slowest path to scale. It is intense, it is resource intensive again. And so we have two levers. One is to work through partners or work with partners, like the formation we have done for moving into Western Uganda. We are working with Swiss Caritas. Northeastern Uganda, we are working with Catholic Relief Services. And in Chad, we are working with Swiss Caritas again. The other pathway, so what we do is we provide technical assistance to these partners to implement a similar model in those contexts. And by that way, we are able to multiply our numbers. One other pathway is now to partner with government. And in fact, in Kenya now, we are implementing a big program with the National Ministry of Labor and Social Protection, where we are building up a government-led graduation approach, simply looking at what is the government preferred safety net or cash transfers, and then how do we build in the graduation approach to be able to support the rollout of those cash transfers, but also the mentorship and coaching and the sequential methodology for graduation approach to achieve sustainable outcomes. We still have a challenge in terms of lack of a policy for graduating cash transfer beneficiaries. There's really no exit plan for them except natural attrition. So we really hope that by the end of this engagement, we can design a suite or a model that the government would then find suitable for also graduating cash transfer beneficiaries, so that they're able to have the capacity to enroll additional one through support from partners like we're having for World Bank for now. Yeah.
Thanks, Sam. Robert, I was wondering if you wanted to sort of chime in here. So you mentioned a moment ago that many African countries have moved in the direction of cash transfer programs, despite the kind of evidence you shared with us that maybe that's not the smartest direction to go. I mean, do you have a sense of the barriers to scale, or maybe the political economy that drives those kind of policy choices?
Well, thank you. No, I think that the first barrier, and one of the things that I think Sarah also alluded to, has to do with the resource intensity, particularly with respect to the graduation programs. So whilst the benefit cost ratios seem to be quite nice, looking at those ratios, the cost elements are quite high, which then means that if you are thinking of scaling up these programs, it's sort of scarce most ministers or implementers. Indeed, in the case of the Ghana program, I think immediately when the science paper came out, we had discussions with our ministry in terms of scaling up, and the minister at the time asked, so Robert, how much are we looking at per beneficiary? Or how much did it cost per beneficiary in terms of the study in Ghana? And I told her, oh, a little over $2,000. She looked at me as if I was crazy. But I think the point I made to her at the time, and she probably didn't buy, was the fact that, of course, it was a pilot study that was being done in a number of countries. But in my view, I think many of these programs, and even with respect to the hand-holding and coaching, which we think are quite important, many of these programs are already being implemented by one agency or the other within the countries, public agencies within the countries. So the bigger challenge has to do with coordination, and to make sure that these programs can then come together with a common purpose or objective, and then drive this change or agenda with respect to the ultra poor. So a lot of the elements are already happening, but in a quite disjointed way. And so if coordination could be improved, the costs associated with these graduation programs, in my view, could reduce quite significantly. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Robert.
Maybe if I can add one more question. As you know, Michael, we've been doing a lot of dialogues, and we have highlighted a lot of innovations that came through the jointly working, the US government funded USAID, USDA, various agencies within USDA have supported a lot of those innovations. And so when you're building the sort of the insurance schemes and to try to reduce shock and in the programs, to what extent do you look for those different type of innovations and try sort of to push those to the people? I mean, particularly with Sam talking about this mentorship, to what extent does those kind of innovations from different things, if you're working in crop production, we talk about soybeans, or with livestock, we've talked about a number of things that he can do, and a lot of experiments, a lot of work has been done in Ethiopia, Kenya, a number of places. So to what extent do you sort of refer to that innovation and basically help people understand, this is something that you can do and sort of helps you reduce their risks as well?
Yeah. I think when you get into social policies, I think ideas often come from different places. So, I mean, the graduation program model, at least as I understand its history, emerged originally from Brock, which was doing Grameen Bank like micro lending, but came to the realization that micro lending wasn't necessarily, debt wasn't necessarily the solution for people that were extremely poor. So if you take a very, very poor woman who can't make ends meet, making her a loan is maybe not the place to start. I think where research has been really important in that particular program, has been around sort of testing the efficacy and also a lot of work on trying to make it work better or make it work more cost effectively. I think in other instances, I think research has been really quite vital to the innovation. So I put in my slides a little bit of theoretical work, which was actually sponsored in large measure by some funding from the U.S. government, that really helped us sort of take our breath, learn from what's out there, but think about what could make it better and what would we, if we model systems carefully, what might we think? So I think there's been a lot of innovations, and frankly, there are sometimes ideas that are just a little too crazy, certainly for the private sector to get a hold of. So this was, I think, shortly before Sarah joined the work on index-based livestock insurance, but I still remember going with Andrew Mude to the High Commissioner's office in Nairobi and telling them we were going to use satellites to predict livestock mortality. And the person from the High Commission suggested that we had lost our minds in a very nice way. And we said, no, that's okay. You don't have to believe us. We want you to know we're doing this. But we were able to get some funding actually from USAID to get it started. And people found out that, yeah, it indeed sounds crazy, but it might actually work. And the High Commissioner eventually sort of came along as well and helped fund that activity. So, that's where, there's different kinds of innovation. And Federica only briefly alluded to this, but in her work in terms of how do you define indices, but the work that's being done often in academic environments on remote sensing, and the HSNP2 and the IBLI products have both been using improved remote sensing methods to make it possible to make payouts earlier. And Frederica kind of alluded to this. This is very much coming from research that is funded sometimes from US government sources, sometimes from others. But then, I think as researchers, we're sort of privileged to be able to think sometimes crazy thoughts and go off in corners and suddenly discover, you could actually make a payout. You can make a payout 6 weeks earlier because the remote sensing is actually reliable enough at that point. And that can, 6 weeks earlier for somebody whose alternative choice is to lose what they have or sell off what they have, can make a huge difference. And it's something Frederica, I think, was very good at presenting. So anyway.
Not to mention the improve forecast, which will make it even earlier than
exactly.
Yeah.
So, okay. Hermes, maybe we've reached the end of our time here, I think.
Yes, I think we are very much approaching to the end. So, well, first of all, thank you, Michael, for stepping in and wearing two hats this morning, which you've done very, very effectively. So, thank you for stepping in, and thank you everybody for joining us today on this USDA Foreign Agricultural Service supported event. We very much appreciate the USDA FA's support to enable rich discussion on all action tracks of the UN Food Systems Summit and highlights innovations developed through US government and host country collaborations. The UN Food Systems Action Track 4 that we were discussing today, 6 ideas that contribute to the elimination of poverty by promoting full and productive employment and decent work for all actors along the food value chain, reducing risks to the world's poorest, enabling entrepreneurship, and addressing the inequitable access to resources and distribution of value. And Action Track 4 is also supposed to improve or look at the resilience through social protection and seek to ensure that food systems leave no one behind. So I think you would agree today's discussion exactly addresses this Action Track 4, and we hope that those discussions will be taken into consideration at the summit in September. So the next steps are that the discussion that we had today will be summarized and will be submitted to the Food Systems Summit in the next couple of weeks. And then we hope that in the next few days or a week or so, we'll be sending you a draft of this report for you to review. And if you could give us your edits within about a week or so, then we'll be able to include it into the final draft. And the recording of today's dialogue will be available in a few weeks on the UC Davis World Food Center website. So thank you again for spending your time and sharing your knowledge with us.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks,
Yeah.
everyone.
Yes, cheers. Bye.
Have a nice evening. Bye.
Thank you.